America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Melso, and today, Dr. Tom Giordano and I will be discussing how bills and new legislations are named in a deceptive manner to hide their true intentions. We'll be taking a look at a couple of them and detail just how the actions of the legislation are in direct opposition to what they are called. I mean, we're all saddled with falsely named legislative acts and the bureaucracies they underpin. From the Federal Reserve Act, by the way, it's something I really wanted to unveil for our audience. We're going to talk to you about the creation of the Federal Reserve. That's a fascinating story, and we'll talk about just how devious lawmakers and money interests can be when they collude to take away your rights. We'll also touch on other acts, like the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the Affordable Care Act, the Patriot Act, and to the most recent and laughable Inflation Reduction Act. It turns out that those in government take a crisis, whether it's real or created, and ram down legislation with no consideration of its negative effects, or worse, precisely for their negative effects. But first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tom, and then we'll continue. Hi, Dr. Tom.
Hey, Rob. So we're finally getting to this episode, and we're going to look at another aspect of political deception today.
It would appear so, Dr. Tom.
That is, other than the false campaign promises, right?
That's right.
Well, I guess false campaign promises never harmed anyone beyond wasting your vote on a liar. The best liars in the world often wind up in politics. But let's go on before I go all South Philly and start cursing, okay?
Yeah, okay. We'd have to edit that out anyway. I guess you could curse in Italian if you want.
Well, that would be colorful, but it wouldn't get us anywhere.
Va bene.
All right. So, let's get this thing off the ground. We got a lot to talk about.
Okay, Dr. Tom, let me first lay out the reasons for proposing a bill before the House and Senate. Let's look at why bills are proposed in general. The process is normally a response to a problem in society or in government. In other words, politicians identify a problem that does exist. Sometimes they create a problem that doesn't. And then they rally a response through a legislative act, giving legitimacy to some governmental authority to deal with it. The act creates and funds another bureaucracy or another agency under the executive's control, although funding and oversight remain with Congress. Any way you look at it, this all increases the government's operating expenses and requires increased taxation. Am I correct?
Exactly. And they never seem to resolve the problem they were created to correct, only deal with it. How do you think our government's yearly operational budget went from 3.5% of the annual income from the formation of the federal government until 1933 to just under 50% of it today? The multiplications of all of these agencies and bureaucracies is the reason for government bloat. People in government can never leave societal problems to society to resolve. Let me ask you, did Prohibition and the Volstead Act work? Did that work? Is the war on drugs working? How about the war on poverty? Oh, and we can't forget education. Affirmative action, Head Start, no kid left behind. Now you tell me, how did kids get left behind if they had a Head Start? Government intervention in practically all of the ills of society is rarely necessary and almost always worsens the target problem and creates even more problems that were, unforeseen. You can always tell we're in for an expensive ride when the government declares war on something.
Well, I'd say all of the above were a damned waste of money. But then let's face it, aren't there some problems in society that need government intervention?
No, sure. You need a road going from A to B. You need a bridge. How about a dam or a levee system to curtail flooding, a flooding river? These are acceptable interventions for the government. Sewage systems, water desalination plants, snow removal in the winter and the like. These are all valid reasons to pass a bill for the benefit of the public. If you recall, the government has constitutional restrictions on what it can spend the taxpayers' monies on. They're specifically spelled out, as we discussed in a previous episode.
I think I get where you're headed with this. You mean what we talked about with the broad interpretation of the clauses of the Constitution, like the welfare clause being written with strict constraints, but then being broadly interpreted to mean, well, just about anything they want it to mean?
Yes, exactly. We have to remember that there is a difference between promoting the general welfare and paying for it. You can promote something by just not interfering with it, get out of the way, or remove the obstacles.
Okay, Dr. Tom, let me ask you to give us a few examples of the government promoting the general welfare by not interfering.
Oh, sure. That's easy. Every single private university and college founded during the 19th and early 20th century, every university hospital and clinic, every museum, every heavy and light industry, every single law, medical, dental, nursing, veterinary, and architecture school, organizations like the Boy Scouts, 4-H, the American Red Cross, and the SPCA. The list is as long as my arm. Is it any wonder that the most venerated institutions in America were all products of like-minded private individuals organizing and pooling their efforts with no government involvement? I mean, even the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument was done by nickel and dime, donations from the children of the United States. I mean, there was no government involvement there.
I see your point, and you made it pretty well. Just think of where we'd be if the government just got out of the way of the American people.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, whether the objectives are sincere or insincere, government interference and intervention have a very poor track record of resolving problems in society. The example we discussed with the abuse of the nuisance laws in episode 13 of this podcast, which eventually led to unbridled pollution and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, is a good illustration. And there are many, many more that we could cite. But I think that there is an even more insidious problem with these bills. They can be amended to expand the original objectives to incorporate things that were not considered when the bill was passed into law. It's called mission creep, and it usually is done with less fanfare than passing the original bill. I mean, it's how something like the EPA can go from cleaning up the environment to grabbing land to protect the spotted owl or the breeding ground of some rat.
Well, I've known some rats in my day, and I think that may have been justified.
Yeah. Well,
when you say these bills violate the Constitution, just what do you mean? They have to go through a constitutional process to exist, don't they?
Well, they can have all of the trappings of a legally enacted bill and still be unconstitutional. You know, Rob, all of these kinds of acts create agencies or departments which have regulatory powers that violate the very purpose of having a constitutional republic. They bypass the legislative procedural operations to push rules and regulations into law with no accountability. They create positions in government for patronage, where inept people occupy positions of authority and exercise immense power over the citizenry. They become protected by self-serving laws, by organized unions, by labor relations arbitration and collective bargaining at the expense of the public. They are also the very source of that mission creep we spoke of.
Dr. Tom, are you implying that some of these bureaucrats are inept?
I'm implying that very few of them aren't.
Well, I'm always amazed at how these people are never held accountable when sitting before congressional or senatorial committee hearings. Why is it that they're never pressed harder? The hearing ends. The witness oftentimes doesn't really answer the questions or states that they can't recall or whatever. Then the hearing's adjourned and the bureaucrat lives on to stay in his position. I think of Dr. Fauci telling us that the vaccine works even when we all knew it didn't, or Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas telling us the border is secure while millions of aliens are crossing. Why isn't there any real accountability? Is Congress that hamstrung when it comes to these agencies? I mean, Congress funds them, right?
Well, all of these agencies are children of the Congress and are funded by it and are required to respond to congressional oversight. But from what I've seen, they're more often than not unresponsive and suffer no consequences for a feigned ignorance. Just like you said, they tap dance around questions and outright lie before these committees. It's just the way it is. Unfortunately, the Congress does not have a police power. It has the power to subpoena, but it can't arrest people. They've got to go through. They've got to go through other agencies of the executive branch to get those things done.
I disagree with you, Dr. Tom. Bannon, Stone, Giuliani, yes, they can suffer consequences. Wray, Holder, Clinton, Comey, Mueller, Garland, any of them on the Democrat side, never. No one raids their homes, their lawyers, or threatens them with lawsuits. It seems a bit one-sided to me.
Well, I don't want to go there right now. People might think there's a two-tiered system of justice. We wouldn't want that. Let's just say that if you think Donald Trump or the American people will ever see justice for the DOJ and FBI corruption, or for the hoaxes presented to the FISA court without rooting out that corruption, you'd better think again.
All right.
Ain't going to happen.
All right. Let's get back on track. If what you're saying is true about these acts, how can we determine if they're good or bad? Can't we identify the hidden agenda by finding out who benefits?
Well, firstly, there are a few things to look at when evaluating a proposed bill and then a law which has been ratified and enacted. The first is, does it support the spirit of constitutional restraints? In other words, if I were to say that the IRS, for example, is unconstitutional, anyone could respond by saying that an amendment was passed following constitutional procedures, as I mentioned before. But just because it followed a legislative procedure doesn't mean it doesn't violate the constitutional intent. Okay? This is why we supposedly have a Supreme Court to weigh in on these matters. The second is how much money is dedicated to enforcement and where is it going? The third is who is being restrained from an activity that favors someone else's activity? Can cartels or a de facto monopoly exist in the private sector without the government's tacit approval or even an outright support? And yes, as you rightly asked, anyone can easily tell what the underlying agenda is by finding out who profits.
So what you're saying is that when a law is passed which places obstructions on activities, it usually empowers someone and weakens someone else. But the effects aren't just upon the private sector and the people's rights, are they?
No. The government itself is not immune from these anti-constitutional bills and amendments. Some are frankly unconstitutional because they intrude upon or overextend the executive powers. Some intrude upon the other branches of government, like the 17th Amendment. The passing from selecting senators from the state's assemblies to electing them by popular vote annulled the very intent and purpose of their existence under the Constitution. It warped the framework of our government. You see, the game that our elected politicians play doesn't even consider the constitutionality of a proposed bill or even an agency created by the legislation once it's passed. They'll worry about the constitutionality, post facto at the Supreme Court. The 17th Amendment should never have even been proposed, let alone passed into law, no matter what their acrobatic legal reasoning was.
Well, most often it's to follow the money trail that we find the source of the beneficiary. Am I correct?
Yes, but in the 17th case, I believe there was a much more nefarious reason for that, which I really don't want to get into right now. All I have to tell you is that the 17th took away the sovereignty of the individual states, which was the very purpose of having a constitutional federal republic. It took that away.
Well, They often, it seems to me, they hide their intentions in plain sight.
Oh, yeah.
It reminds me of Nancy Pelosi with the Affordable Care Act, 900 pages leading to 11,000 pages of rules and regulations that we were told had to pass before anybody could read it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the name is the lie. It's not affordable. It has nothing to do with care. It raised insurance premiums, in some cases, 400%. And as far as care goes, it has nothing to do with it. It has everything to do with just who pays for medical service. It's got nothing to do with care. It's just a thinly veiled first attempt to control and redistribute 1/6 of the economy and to create a single payer, socialized system of healthcare. That's all it was. They bragged about it afterwards. They bragged about it.
I remember clearly the effects this act had on small businesses, and it wasn't good. Employees' hours were cut. The percentages paid by employers went down. And in some cases, people lost their jobs. Deductibles increased, and so did copays. My own business, saw huge increases in insurance premiums after it took effect.
Well, the pushers of this abomination claimed that there were 30 million uninsured in the country, but they never gave you the reasons for that. They never gave you the reasons. They completely ignored polls that showed that 85% of the people were satisfied with their coverage. In any case, we really don't want to get into the details of Obamacare. As it stands, the Republicans think they got some kind of a victory by striking down the individual mandate. But the rest of the law remains. A real victory would have been repealing the entire thing.
Another disappointment to me.
Yeah,
the thing that frosts me was this guy, Jonathan Gruber, who famously said he was relying on the stupidity of the American voter to pass the bill. Dr. Tom, I think we both realize there are problems with the way our healthcare system works. Do you think the government has any role in making it easier to navigate?
Rob, what would you say if I told you that it was government interference in a private sector business that caused all of the problems in the first place? State and federal governments and unions negotiated hospital care contracts for large blocks of people at reduced rates and provided a reliable income for these institutions. They only started in a few hospitals in Texas in 1929. They were intended for catastrophic care and surgery, not for sniffles and Band-Aids. The general public has to pay more to compensate for the reduced rates for the same services provided to government employees. Health insurance really only became extensive in the late 50s and early 60s. Another cause of the increased cost of insurance was by government stepping in and eliminating competition between insurance companies across state lines. How many health insurers are there in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
Well, there's two, Blue Cross and Aetna.
Two. Makes it much easier to collude under government-secured cartel, huh? Reasonable and customary is the term they'd use to get away with fixing prices. Imagine if you had dozens of insurance companies across the country in competition with these two. Don't you think the costs would come down? Don't you see it with every other form of insurance? Automobile, home insurance. It's not a ridiculous concept.
Yeah, I can reduce my automobile insurance anytime I want just by going online and asking them for their rate. Okay, but what kind of care can you get with no insurance?
At an emergency room? There are laws on the books in every state in the union that assure that emergency care cannot be denied to anyone regardless of ability to pay. Do you think the millions of illegal aliens who cross the border for medical care in the United States have insurance? Are they turned away from the ERs? They place a huge drain on services and resources that you have to pay for. I don't see the federal government sending these healthcare bills to their national governments for payment, do you?
Well, that sounds like a good idea to me. I wonder how quickly that flood of illegal aliens would stop if our government charged their native countries for these services. But how would you do that?
Oh, that's easy. That's easy. Add a tariff to their imports to our markets or our exports to their markets. If we give them foreign aid, for example, subtract it out of the money before it's transferred. Another way would be to freeze portions of their assets in U.S. banks until the debts are paid. There are ways, I can assure you. Any way they could go after you, they could go after our government.
Out of curiosity, and for our audience sake, how was medical care paid before there was insurance? Today, we can't think about one without the other.
Oh, it's paid by either direct exchange or by donation. Practically all of the hospitals, clinics, and ambulatories were run by philanthropic institutions, charities, religious organizations, university medical schools, and the like. Patients were asked to donate what they could, but the services were generally paid by the donations of wealthy people in society who were grateful for the care they had received. They sold monuments, plaques of recognition, hospital wings and campuses, were named for great and generous donors and corporations who contributed monies to the expansion and operation of these centers. You have a perfect example of how they operated across the river from you in Jersey. Deborah Heart and Lung Center operates this way. It operates this way today. It was founded as a Jewish philanthropic institution for the treatment of tuberculosis, I believe in the early 20s. I may be mistaken, but all of the university hospitals in Philly operated in this way until the 50s. Jefferson, Temple, Hahnemann, St. Agnes, PCOM, and many others. And there were many philosophies of therapeutics to choose from. Allopathic medicine. I really don't like that term. Let's just call it Western biomedicine, the common medical practice today. There was homeopathy, osteopathy, chiropractic, naturopathy, naturopathy, and the patients had the choice within their hands. They could go to anywhere they pleased.
I think we mentioned this in a previous episode, the rising cost of healthcare. When we look at the astronomical prices, don't you think there should be a way to contain the increases in the cost of healthcare?
There is a way. Unimpeded, open competition between providers. Besides this, we spoke about inflation, okay? Inflated prices for the private sector are the result of government interference. Again, reserving resources at negotiated prices below what the market prices would have been. As I said, the price for services is driven up by the providers in areas of healthcare not covered by their contracts and in services they provide to both sectors. So, they have to balance out their books. One thing is sure, where the government controls the entire operation, such as with the Veterans Administration, it is almost always a complete failure. They have no fiscal worries. All they do is ask for more appropriations to cover their inefficiencies. And those appropriations either come from taxes, right, or from government debt to the Federal Reserve. This is just another source of the false impression given to the public by masking the effects of inflation, the devaluation of the dollar by pumping more of them into circulation with no backing in real currency.
I would say that there are other doctor organizations and private corporation entities like Impact Health Sharing. They can offer 50 to 70% cheaper care than Blue Cross Blue Shield, and with better care and more individual control. So you can see where some of these institutions, grassroots, are starting to fight back.
Right. Health savings accounts, for example, are another one. You simply organize yourself to cover your deductible and your copays if you want to a certain amount. You could lower the expenses of your of what you're paying in premiums. If you raise your deductible, you put that money into a bank account to cover that and then keep rolling it over year for year if you don't use it. And on top of it, you could write it off as a tax write-off. I mean, there are plenty of things you could do. But, the government's never going to do anything to save you money. They don't care. Why would they care? Well, they're interested in this, that's the very reason we're talking about this subject today. They don't care. They'll lie to your face. The Federal Reserve is a perfect example of it. Talking about inflation, and you want to find the source of inflation.
Okay, let's get to that next. So I get it so far. If the government gets involved to solve a perceived problem, hold on to your wallet. Is that the moral of the story?
Oh, absolutely. Hold on to your wallet and your bank account.
Okay, Dr. Tom, let's get on to one of my favorite peeves, the Federal Reserve System.
Well, in reality, the system is only half of the problem. The other half of the problem is the government and unrestrained spending. There are two sides to the equation, and the government's deficit spending of monies it doesn't have and has to borrow through a private IOU cabal of credit at interest is the real monster in the room. It's hand in glove. And, talk about the lie being in the name to hoodwink the public. The Federal Reserve Act is another perfect example. It's not federal, it's private. It's not a reserve. They print the money up on demand. You can't even call it a central bank. It only has a loose association with the federal government and is not subject to audit at all. You'd have, even if you pass a constitutional amendment to audit the thing, you can't do it. It's a private organization.
Okay. Well, Dr. Tom, people never really ask how we got here to begin with. With all of this inflation and the devaluation of the dollar, we discussed this to some extent in a previous episode, explaining what it is. But if I were to ask you to pin the problem on specific administrations in government, leaving out the self-serving cabal that came up with the plan, who would you blame?
We're talking about executive branch administrations that played decisive roles in the devaluation of the currency?
Well, yes, I have an idea, but which presidents played a role in the environment we're in now? What I mean to ask is the most recent law that was passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, which we'll get to a bit later, a consequence of the Federal Reserve Act being passed a little more than 100 years ago? What I'm asking is there a link between them? As we talked about with the courts and government ignoring the nuisance laws, which led to pollution and then the EPA.
Well, if you're asking me if there are parallels, yes, there are, but only in the naming. You see, the Fed and the government are the perpetrators of inflation. Together, they produce it. The Fed was created specifically to expand the money supply in times of crisis. And the Inflation Reduction Act does nothing to reduce inflation. It only has inflation in the name. So, it's quite the opposite, actually.
All right. Can you clarify all of that for our audience? Maybe give us some background for the creation of the Federal Reserve?
Okay, let's take a look at what was happening around the turn of the last century and the reasoning politicians gave to the public to create the Fed. Now, Teddy Roosevelt set in motion progressivism during his presidency. Now, Roosevelt was the Republican president from 1901 to 1909. Their most recent panic, which was the term that they used for a run on the banks, leading to a recession, occurred in 1907, so it was under his watch. Now, at the time, there was no central bank. In fact, there is no provision for one in the U.S. Constitution. People in government had tried and failed 3 times to set one up. On a side note, there were 5 presidents who were openly against either the creation of a central bank or the Federal Reserve System.
Who were they, Dr. Tom?
Well, Jackson, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and Kennedy. And Jackson was the only one who wasn't shot.
Okay. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
I guess even presidents who oppose this, the banking cartel, aren't safe.
Yeah, I guess not. But in any case, let's, to get back to the topic, the government was bailed out of a similar financial crisis in 1895 by J.P. Morgan and other Wall Street types. In 1907, they went to Morgan again to organize some private sector investments and lines of credit to stabilize the banking system for the present panic. Up until that time, these were the last 2 in a series of panics that popped up in about every 15 to 20-year cycles from the beginning of our republic. All they knew then was that some insignificant event in the market, like a local bank failure or a crop failure, severe weather, or rumors of doom and gloom, would trigger people to run to their banks and pull out all of their savings. The banks were known to just close their doors and take off with the depositors' funds. I mean, do you remember that film, It's a Wonderful Life, with James Stewart and Donna Reed? I mean, they air it every single Christmas.
Yes, I do. And I remember that famous line, every time there's a run on a bank, a bureaucrat gets his wings.
Yeah. No, it was, I believe, Clarence was his name. And I believe he said, every time a bell rings, an angel gets their wings. But
I think I'm getting too wrapped up in the topic here.
Yeah, I guess so. You're not going to find any angels in the banking system, I'll tell you that. But anyway, that'll give you an idea of what happened in these bank runs, as they were called. Now, those progressive people in government did not want to go on relying to the wealthy private citizens, to deal with economic or financial crises. And as a result of the latest panic, an emergency currency law was enacted in May of 1908. The legislation was called the Aldrich-Vreeland Act. It led to the creation of the National Monetary Commission. Now, the commission's purpose was to investigate monetary systems and European banking and to advise Congress on reforms of our own banking system, something that they had no authority under the Constitution to do, okay? But in any case, these reports gave support to the creation of a system to give elasticity to the currency by permitting national banks, these are national banks now, to issue additional currency on bonds of states, cities, towns, and counties, as well as just to write up commercial paper. After a year of revision by the commission, Aldrich came up with a plan and presented it to Congress in 1912. This was during the Taft administration, and it concluded that there was a need for a National Reserve Association.
All right, Dr. Tom, let me stop you here. Years ago, I read a book which documented the formation of the Federal Reserve called The Creature from Jekyll Island. It was written by a man named G. Edward Griffin. You've read that book, right?
Yes, I have. My brother Eddie gave it to me several years ago to read. I was getting to that. Many people have called Griffin a conspiracy theorist, but if you go to the Federal Reserve's webpage, they actually brag about the story that Griffin outlines. What I was recounting before was the official version that the government gave at the time. It was the apparent truth, let's put it that way. It was the truth that satisfied the public, who would have fiercely objected to the government entering into a cabal with private bankers. Hidden from the public view was a secret cabal which included private bankers and a couple of high-placed government officials. This started supposedly with a meeting held in November of 1910 on an island off the coast of Georgia owned by J.P. Morgan.
Okay, do you remember who these people were or who they represented?
Well, not to get into too much detail, there was the senator we spoke of, Aldrich. There was the assistant secretary of the Treasury, and four others representing national and international banking consortia, which were all in competition with each other. Okay?
I understand the cover they used was that they were going to be hunting ducks. Did they get any pate that evening?
Yeah, hunt ducks. It was more a mission to let loose some red herrings rather than to hunt ducks. I mean, they were lining their ducks up in a row, though. These guys were on a mission, and it wound up being one of the greatest con jobs ever perpetrated on the citizens of the United States.
Dr. Tom, as I recall from the book, the bankers present were fierce competition to each other. What they really feared was the free market competition from the newer state-chartered banks that were sprouting up throughout the United States. They feared them even more. Is that right?
Oh, yes, yes. Doesn't it sound like the exact model that Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano used to create organized crime in the United States? Anyway, you're right. One of the reasons for this meeting was to end the growing competition from the nation's newer banks. But they also needed to get a license from the federal government to create money out of thin air. You see, with the gold and silver standard in place, it would be impossible to have an elastic money supply. You just can't counterfeit these metals. You can only debase them by changing the alloy or by reducing the weight while maintaining the same face value and forcing the public to accept it. Also, they wanted to take care of the reserves of all of the banks to reduce the exposure of the ones with reckless lending practices to avoid currency drains and bank runs. In other words, they wanted the ability to bring reserve monies in the back door while the bank's creditors were banging on the front door. But here's the thing, though. They needed to find a way to have the American citizen cover the cartel's unavoidable losses. And they needed to convince Congress that their purpose was to protect the public's interest. Now, remember, this was in November of 1910. This means that the entire political process was a subterfuge, giving an air of legitimacy to a scheme of organized theft.
Okay, let me summarize. So what we have here is the government telling people they were going to stop the panics, that is the bank runs, and then implying that their deposits would be safe from now on. Yet behind the scenes, the cartel of private bankers would grab hold of the money supply for their own interests. Does that about sum it up?
Exactly. Yes, it does. It starts under Teddy Roosevelt, develops under William Howard Taft, even though he had nothing to do with it. It was developing under his administration. And it's signed into law by Woodrow Wilson 2 days before Christmas in 1913. But let's not forget the banksters' long-term plan here. Firstly, they had to get Congress to pass an amendment to establish Congress's right to impose a federal income tax. Okay? These monies would be used to secure the Federal Reserve's loans with federal income taxes. They worked on this concomitantly. The 16th Amendment gave Congress the power to tax personal income. This was a necessary component for the Federal Reserve Act, and this was passed by Congress in July of 1909 and ratified in February of 1913, 10 months before the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. So you see the time sequence? Secondly, they had to slowly get rid of the gold and silver standard over time and replace it with a system of private IOUs and then pass legal tender laws for the general acceptance of the Federal Reserve notes. This was accomplished in 1933 by Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 6102, forbidding the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates by American citizens. Now, Americans had to turn in their gold with a threat of confiscation by a certain date. They were compensated at $20.67 per ounce. Almost overnight after the gold was turned in, an artificial value of $35 per ounce was set. Thirdly, even before FDR's role in the scheme, the banksters had also taken advantage of the stock market collapse in 1929 to deal with the competition from the state chartered banks that were not part of their club.
You know, Dr. Tom, I heard that they held just enough senators from Christmas break in order to pass it. it would not have passed with a full Senate in session.
Now, you're talking about the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
Yes.
Yes, that's probably true. That's probably true. I didn't look into what the vote was, but why wouldn't they do that? Why wouldn't they wait till the Christmas holiday in order to pass something as monumental as that?
All right, let's move on. How did they use the Wall Street collapse in 1929 to eliminate their competition?
Well, remember, their mandate was to inflate the money supply to bail out the banks in the event of a panic, okay? This was the sole reason given by government for the Fed's creation. Instead, they actually contracted the money supply by 30%, and about 1/3 of the banks had to close their doors and went belly up. The Fed's plan favored themselves and actually worsened the situation for everyone else.
Well, what a nice way to eliminate competition.
Yeah, well.
Wasn't there another downturn in the economy just after the First World War? What happened then? Did the Fed do anything to resolve that?
Oh, yeah, Robbie, you're 100% right. Now, listen carefully. There was an actual depression in 1920, which was worse than the 1929 depression. No one ever talks about this one, though. The Harding administration refused any kind of fiscal stimulus. Instead, what Harding did was what was permissible to him under the Constitution. He cut the government's budget by half and slashed the tax rates for every income group. The national debt was reduced by 1/3. The Federal Reserve did nothing, zero, zilch, to fulfill its mandate and adjust the money supply and counter the contraction. By late summer of 1921, signs of recovery were already apparent. In 1922, unemployment dropped from double digits to 6.7% and dropped even more to 2.4% by 1923. In other words, Harding allowed the shock to the market to adjust itself, and it did. In short order, and with no direct meddling from the government or the Federal Reserve in the economy, we bounced back. I think there is a lesson to be learned here, don't you?
Well, yes, and the economy of the 20s was a boom for wealth. So, are you saying that the government and the Fed did not play with the money supply or interest rates in the 1920 depression, and it shot back within 2 years? And these two interfered with the 29 depression, and now that lasted for decades. That's pretty telling.
Yes, that's it. And pretty disgusting. You see, the politicians and banksters cooked up this scheme for their own interests. We spoke of the meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910. Incidentally, it was on my birthday, November 22nd, 1910. But this could not possibly have been the first meeting, because they had already set in motion the 16th Amendment, which was a keystone to the scam. I mean, it was the cornerstone to the edifice they were building. By the time they held that meeting in November of 1910, the process was already going for the 16th Amendment. They obviously had coordinated the two acts to pass in sequential order.
Now, the 16th Amendment gave the government the ability to tax for our audience sake.
That's right. The 16th Amendment,
okay,
as we said before, is the amendment that gives Congress the authority to tax personal income from any source derived, is the wording. So it's personal income tax, yes.
Okay, Dr. Tom, let me ask this question. If the government simply wanted to soften the effects of bank runs, couldn't they have found a simpler solution without involving the banking consortia?
No, they did. They did. In 1933, after the dereliction of the Federal Reserve to fulfill its mandate, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, as we call it today, was created. It became an essential part of the American financial system. This was the most reasonable solution to address insecurities on the part of depositors. Just insure their deposits. It would have been in the FDIC's best interest to oversee ethical banking practices, since it stood to lose money. they could have ended reckless lending practices easily. Since it went into action in 1934, no insured depositor has lost a solitary cent of their deposits due to a bank failure. However, banksters are schemers. I'm not even sure it had any effect on the reckless lending practices of the banks simply because the Fed still exists. I mean, what did we see with the real estate bubble implosion in 2008? In any case, if the Federal Reserve Act had truly been enacted for the reasons those in government promoted, it should have been repealed and dissolved in 1934, and the FDIC should have taken its place. It failed the public's fiduciary test miserably.
You know, Dr. Tom, I've heard continually that most economists will say that the 1929 Depression was a failure of capitalism or the market system.
Yeah, I've heard it too, but Rob, don't be confused. Capitalism and the markets never fail. People do. People are the ones making decisions, both good and bad. You know, people claim capitalism is a system of profit. It's all profit, profit. No. Capitalism is a system of profit and losses, and the losses are just as important as the profits.
All right, Dr. Tom. Well, that was a pretty concise denouncement. Now let's get back to my original question. Who else contributed to the attack of the dollar?
Okay, well, let's go over it. We have Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR. Then we come to Harry Truman. Truman's administration with the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. You know, under this system, the U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency for the Reconstruction after World War II. Since gold was still the basis for the U.S. dollar, talking about the U.S. Treasury dollar, okay, other currencies were pegged to its value. You see, gold had been taken out of circulation by FDR as a currency internally, and the Federal Reserve notes were detached from it. But it was not yet detached from the Treasury dollars in international trade. Other countries could come to the U.S. and exchange our trade dollars for their gold value, about $37 an ounce. This ended in the early 1970s when Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. would no longer exchange gold for U.S. currency in international trade. Gold and silver were completely out, and the IOUs, with no backing in real currency, were finally in. The Federal Reserve's coup was finally completed. These people think in terms of decades to get what they want.
Wow, and since that time, we've seen the price of gold shoot up astronomically. As you've told us in a previous podcast, the price of an ounce of gold is still the only way to understand the purchasing power of our paper money, even though it is detached. Dr. Tom, can I ask you what you think the minimum amount of inflation should be? I mean, we always hear debates between economists that it should be this amount or that amount. I think I remember Dr. Milton Friedman proposing 2.5% per year as acceptable.
Well, Rob, I'm absolutely in no position to contradict Dr. Friedman, one of my idols, by the way. But I have to say that Dr. Friedman surprised me on a couple of occasions. One was his objection to returning to the gold standard, and the other one was this. To my mind, theft is theft. Whether it is 2.5% or 14% makes little difference in terms of morality or damage. I have yet to meet anyone who is wise enough or informed enough to determine what the money supply should be, or even how to arrive at that number, and do so while avoiding theft.
All right. Well, what about adjustments for inflation? Couldn't they find a mechanism to adjust the real value of wages, prices, and the like, taking into account the effect of the devaluation of the currency? I mean, increased salaries and interest rates and the like follow the trends of inflation, right?
Well, it sounds good, but it's just another deception. It takes about a year and a half to see the effects of dumping more money and credit into circulation. By the time you're adjusting it with more dumping, it's too little too late. Besides, when people look at the numbers, they're always comparing recent dates along a time trajectory to one another, never to when the dollar had a true dollar value, say 1920. Today, the price of an ounce of gold is $1,800. In 1920, it was $20.
So you're saying that what you could have bought for $20 in 1920 will now cost you $1,800. Let me think. That's 1,800 divided by 20. That's 90. So today, $90 has the buying power or value of $1 in 1920.
That's it, Rob. I hope the consequences of handing over the ability to expand or contract the money supply at will to about 19 guys in Washington and New York is beginning to hit home. This is exactly what they do by playing with national interest rates and buying treasury bonds with Federal Reserve counterfeit dollars and credit. They can manipulate the economy at will. They can keep interest rates high or low. They can foster economic growth or they can hinder it. They can inflate gigantic bubbles one day and just pop them the next. Most Americans give credit or blame to the presidents, for the economy when they have very little control over it. I mean, I guess they could veto any bill that comes before them, which requires deficit spending or Federal Reserve loans to enforce it. But, good luck with that.
Yeah, they might get shot.
Yeah, exactly.
I have always known this discussion was sickening. But hearing you tell it, it makes me realize just how deceitful the whole scam is. I knew we were going to look at the newest con job that came out of the government recently, the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the subject of this episode was the lie is in the name. So I looked into just what was in this act. If it had anything to do with reducing inflation, it was lost on me.
That's because it's nothing more than a condensed version of the Build Back Better bill with a little Obamacare horse dung thrown in for good measure. All it does is make huge investments in the nation's so-called social safety net.
Exactly. What I found was that the monies are directed towards investments in combating climate change. They stab at lowering the cost of prescription drugs and raising taxes on corporations.
Exactly. The lie is in the name. While its name declares that it'll bring down soaring inflation, it somehow claims to do this by increasing inflation through more debt to the Federal Reserve. Did you read any studies on the supposed impact on the inflation rate the act will have?
Well, I've read a couple, one by the Wharton School of Economics here in Philadelphia, one by the Congressional Budget Office, and then I looked at the consumer price indexes. The Penn-Wharton budget model concluded that there's very little evidence that the legislation will have any impact on inflation. And the same goes for the Congressional Budget Office. Now, the CBO is a federal agency that provides budget and economic information to Congress. They concluded that the bill will barely make a dent on inflation in the short run. In fact, it may very well bump it upward. They also claim that in 2023, the effect upon the inflation rate will be somewhere between 0.1 percentage point lower and 0.1 percentage point higher than it is currently.
What? You did say somewhere between 0.1 percentage point lower and 0.1 percentage point higher than it is currently.
That's what they claim.
I mean, who writes this crap? Rob, what's between 0.1% lower and 0.1% higher? Take the average. Negative 0.1 plus positive 0.1 divided by 2.
Let me get out my thinking pencil. I think that comes to 0.
Yes, 0. So much for inflation reduction. And that's being generous. I really don't know who these people think they're kidding. I especially like how they play games with numbers and how they conveniently decide what to leave out of the inflation calculations.
Yes, I know what you're saying. The difference between inflation and core inflation.
Yeah.
I was always a little perplexed by the removal of food, gas, oil, electricity, utilities, housing, travel, and the like from the calculations to give lower numbers. These, in fact, are the things people have to deal with every day in their budgets, yet they're not factored into core inflation numbers.
Yeah, I wonder why. It couldn't possibly be because they don't want people to actually know how much they're being screwed, or better, confirm how much they're being screwed.
Yeah, well, it's not like people can't see prices rising and their wallets getting lighter. So what's next? I don't even want to review all the CPI data, but those things don't look good.
What's next? Well, the Federal Reserve will come out with their annual report. If things improve, they'll claim it was because of their heroic and decisive actions. If things don't, they'll report that it would have been much worse had it not been for their heroic and decisive actions, and everybody will cheer. You know, they wrote that script in the 1920s and have been using it ever since.
All right, Dr. Tom, we spent a good bit of our time on the Federal Reserve. I think we've beat that up enough. When we look at inflation today, I guess you could make the strong argument that the Federal Reserve System is the mechanism behind it. The way I see it, though, the driver of inflation is government spending.
Yes, that's true. That sums it up in a nutshell.
All right, let's sort of wrap this up. Let's have fun. Let's have fun with this.
Yeah, I was getting a headache.
Yeah. Let me give you the name of an act, and then you can give me the actual devious effect of the act, okay?
Okay.
So, in other words, what would you have named them to describe them accurately, knowing that the purpose of the name was subterfuge?
Oh, boy. That sounds like fun.
All right, how about these? Okay, we just got done with this one. The Federal Reserve Act.
The Federal Reserve Act? Okay, how about the Enslavement of America by Fiat Currency Act?
All right. Okay, that's good. All right, let me give you another one. How about the Patriot Act?
The Patriot Act? All right. The abolishment of the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendment without a constitutional amendment act.
Okay, you're too long on these, Tom, but we'll go with that. All right. All right, let me give you another one. The Inflation Reduction Act.
The Inflation Reduction Act? How about the Green New Steel, Drug Company Bash, and Driving Out of the Wealthy Act?
Okay, very good. How about the Affordable Care Act?
The Affordable Care Act? How about the Pay for Someone Else and Get Less Care Yourself Act?
Okay, right. The Social Security Act.
The Ponzi Scheme of America Act.
All right, okay. All right, here's some policy. Let me try this one.
Okay, policies, huh? Okay.
No Child Left Behind.
How about the No Child Advances More Than Another Act?
Okay, that's a good one. How about Head Start?
Assured Academic Failure Act.
Okay. How about Affirmative Action?
How about the Abolishment of Meritocracy Act?
Okay. The War on Drugs.
How about the Establishment of Foreign Drug Cartel Enrichment Act?
Okay. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
Well, it wound up spying on American citizens, so how about the Spying of American Citizens Without Due Process of Law Act?
All right, I think that about sums things up.
I think we got the point across.
All right.
So, yeah, I think that's enough.
So, Dr. Tom, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to make a statement here, and let's see if you agree with me. Actually, it's a question. What made us the greatest country in the world? And I'll answer it. It was our good sense. So the moral of this is to not allow people to lie to you. Remember these acts, and the next time they come up with another, well, at least you'll be ready to rebuff those who try to tell you they'll help. Remember this too. There are no solutions to problems. There are only trade-offs. And almost invariably, the unintended consequences are real and often worse than the problems they attempt to solve. In any case, what happens normally is that the government grows bigger and individuals grow smaller. Think about that the next time you hear the newest fly. All right, so we're going to end this here. Thank you, Dr. Tom, for another enlightening interview. And I'll say that we're going to be off for the next week or so. I'm on vacation. So we're going to be coming out with a surprise episode when I come back, and it's going to be about current events, about the recent election and some other things. So stay tuned, and until then, we'll see you next time. You've been listening to The Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.